Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about bipolar disorder, and I'm going to start with what we know bipolar disorder as before it was established as a term. There's obviously always been people who have had bipolar disorder, but we can date it back to the 1st century in Greece. The Greeks and Romans are responsible for the term mania, which is a very common term we use today, and they discovered that lithium salts calmed most symptoms. Individuals who had bipolar disorder were executed. And treatments included restraints, draining of blood, and applying an eel to the skull. So the draining of the blood is very dramatic. But they also, not only did they use it for mental illness, but physical illness. They just thought that the blood was what was infected, and they just ended up killing everyone. So it didn't even work out in their benefit. And then applying an eel to the skull, the idea behind that is just the eel's just going to suck out whatever is going on inside of the head. Just not another good thing. I don't want to butcher this name. Every time I say it, I just butcher it. So is it Jean? Is that how you say it?
Jean-Pierre is what I would go
Okay.
with. Jean-Pierre.
Yeah, I always butcher it. So he is credited for publishing an article in 1851 with the term La Folie circulaire, which means circular insanity. He put manic episodes and bipolar together, so they've always been a thing, but they've always been credited as something separate. And he's also credited as the first documented diagnosis of bipolar disorder. This is a lovely picture of him. And so bipolar disorder through the DSM. So in the DSM-1, it broke manic depressive insanity into 3 types. Manic, depression, and then other, which is where bipolar disorder fell into. And for the DSM-2, it was defined as manic depressive illness. And then in the DSM-3, this is the first time it was acknowledged, and this was in 1880. And then in the DSM-4, there were 6 types of bipolar disorder, and an individual would be diagnosed into these based on if they were hypermanic, like how their manic episodes were, so if they were hypermanic or hypomanic. And then obviously what we use today, an individual has to experience at least 1 episode of mania. And then that leads us to type 1 bipolar and type 2. So type 1, an individual has to have 1 manic episode followed by a depressive episode, and psychosis is very common because the manic episodes are so severe. And then in type 2, 1 depressive episode is followed by a hypomanic episode. Manic episodes are not present. And so for early treatments in the late 19th century, I'm going to butcher this one too, barbiturates?
Barbiturates?
Yeah. I was literally in nursing school, I learned about these, but they were used. From the 50s to the 60s, lithium gained popularity, but it was not FDA approved until the 70s. And then in the 90s, lithium was the primary medication used. From the 2000s until now, individuals are prescribed mood stabilizing drugs, and they are also recommended to go to psychotherapy. Society plays a very big part in all mental illness, but really this is about bipolar. So individuals were considered possessed in Greek times. That's why they were executed. And then in the 1850s, not the 50s, it was new to the world. So individuals were introduced to something, like they might have been experiencing it, but they didn't have a term behind it. And those who were not directly affected by it were introduced to it. So there was a lot of curiosity. So if you didn't have someone who was bipolar in your life, that was kind of like a new term to you, so you were probably just more curious than you were making people seem crazy. And then in the early 1900s, symptoms were considered made up. If an individual had bipolar disorder, they were considered dramatic and shameful. This was directed towards women because men didn't think they had mental illness. And then in the 90s, bipolar disorder is considered severe, rare, incurable, and only found in adults, and we know all these not to be true now. And then in the 2000s until now, it's really considered a women's illness, and this is severely portrayed through the media, but it's also portrayed that individuals who are bipolar are just crazy. Like, you can't talk to them, they just do very out of the ordinary things. So that leaves us with about 46 million people globally are diagnosed with bipolar disorder, well, currently. And then there are more than 3 million cases per year in the United States. Treatments include mood stabilizers, antipsychotics, antidepressants, psychotherapy. Signs and symptoms include a manic episode followed by a depressive episode. But when an individual is being manic, they're talking excessively, they're awake for long periods of time, they're not being rational, they have delusions. And then that's followed by depression, so they're just extremely fatigued, prolonged sadness, memory loss, poor nutrition. And there needs to be improvements for mental illness all around, but specifically bipolar. I think these are kind of like my opinion, but it's based on things that are currently going wrong. So improvements with medication, I would say, I'm aware that we can't just eliminate side effects, but I think we should be prescribing a medication that has the least amount of side effects, because those tend to, for like individuals, it can be a determining factor if they're going to take it or not. Like a very common side effect is weight gain, and individuals just don't want to gain weight, so they're just not going to take the medication, which results in them not seeking help. Further research on a cause, we can't pinpoint one specific cause for bipolar disorder. So I think if it's not like a hereditary thing, and if it's an environmental factor, we can educate individuals, warn them, and then decrease the amount of people who are bipolar. Improvements with diagnosing, so individuals who are bipolar but are diagnosed with severe depressive disorders and they're treated for that, they spiral out into a really bad manic episode, and then that just causes more problems in its own. So I think we need to be very focused on diagnosing not only bipolar disorder, but every disorder, every mental illness, and then searching for other treatments. So specifically with this, individuals are experiencing super high highs and super low lows. So when they are on the medication, they're leveled out a little bit. They're probably not used to that, so that's like a new normal for them. And I think that they should be educated on how to navigate that, so it's not just like a shock to them when it happens. And then here's my resources. Do we have any questions?
Could you say a little bit more? We realize it's not only in adults anymore, and yet I think like very young children would not be diagnosed with bipolar. Did you read at all about sort of where in the age range do we start to recognize it?
It was more around like mid to late teens.
Okay.
From the stuff that I read. I'm not sure entirely, but that's where it basically came up. Yeah. It didn't mention anything about children, but for the most part, people just think that it's in adults, but individuals can be diagnosed obviously as early as like teens. So.
Do you know what the actual ratio with males and females for this disorder is?
No. But my guess is there's a lot of men that have it, but they're not seeking help because they don't think that they have it, because people do think women have it over men, but no, I didn't see anything about that. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit more about how Jean-Pierre maybe discovered it, or how that sort of got separated? Like, what was it confused with before?
So he was focused on how the manic episode was directly followed by the depressive episode. Before that, they were just two separate things. Like, people knew that they were having one of each, but they didn't know that they were linked. So he was focused on individuals who had both, because people can be manic and people can be depressive, but putting them together. So
he was the first one to put them together,
yeah.
And that's kind of how that found
yeah.
happened. I have one more question then.
Okay.
Can you talk a little bit about how it evolved within the DSM? So why did we see so many changes from one DSM to the next? Like what caused that evolution, or what do you think based on your research?
I think, and this is just from stuff that I read, it didn't specifically say, I just think that we as like a society was evolving towards mental illness. I could be wrong, I guess, I don't really know, but that's just my opinion, because from the time that the first DSM came out until when bipolar disorder was mentioned, there had been a lot of changes for everything.
Mm-hmm.
So I just think that mental illness was becoming more common. So, but I don't know specifically.
Okay. Thank you. Anybody else have any other questions?